Our lecture today is going to be all about line. And if you had told me when I first started teaching that I had to come up with a lecture that just dealt with this formal element, and I was supposed to spend an hour on it, I would have told you you were insane. But what I found out about line, the more and more I got into it, was how versatile and how important this tool is for the artist. It is one of the three foundational blocks of the formal elements, which is line, space, and color. Lines are capable of infinite variety. They can be long or short, straight or curved, thick or thin. They can be static or dynamic. They can be aggressive or passive. Lines have the ability to change direction. They can define the boundaries of shapes and surfaces. They can connect objects as well as divide them. Line can create mood. And certain lines that we're going to talk about are so powerful, they can be invisible. When I write my name, all I'm doing is creating line. The definition of a line is a point set in motion. We're going to look at first some characteristics of line. When we look at a horizontal line, it's going to mimic a body, asleep or at rest. And if you can imagine an edge of a folder laying down on a table, how much motion do we expect to see from that folder? Well, absolutely none, because it's just going to lay there. And the same thing happens to us when we look at horizontal line in paintings. In this painting here, we have a tremendous amount of horizontals that make up the ripples of the water, the edges of the boat, and even the landscape behind them is very horizontal. How fast is this canoe moving? It really isn't. It's just drifting there. And that's because of the tremendous amount of horizontal line. When we look at vertical line, this also mimics a body, this time in an upright position. So imagine that folder sitting upright. We have a potential for movement because we can get some wind that can knock the folder down. Someone can hit the table the folder is standing on. Someone can just naturally knock it over. But still, this line is going to be pretty static. Here, these individual vertical lines that are made up of these 47 individuals in this painting have the potential for movement, but it's still a pretty quiet painting. Keep in mind also that we have roughly all their faces on a horizontal line, and that plateau of the hillside behind them is also horizontal. Now, Funeral at Ornans by Courbet is a painting of the artist's hometown, the individuals that live there, the artist's own family at his funeral. So we have just to the bottom center of the grave, we have the artist's father and his dog. Weeping behind him are the 5 sisters the artist has, and all the rest of the people are recognizable townspeople from the city of Ornans. It's diagonal line where we really start to get motion and dynamism in art. That diagonal line is an unstable body position. And the same thing is if we move that folder on a diagonal and we take our hand away from that folder, the folder's going to fall. And it's going to happen time and time again. And that clicks in our brain that it is an unstable position. Change is imminent. And when we add diagonal line to a painting, we get a painting that's full of action. We have this ship at sea in the background tilting at a 45-degree angle. That angle is mirrored in the edge of the lifeboat with the grasp of the person being rescued from the water. Even the rock outcroppings on the left-hand side, those are also at that degree angle. In the background, we can see opposing diagonals from the storm coming down from the clouds. So we have a very active, very dynamic scene in front of us, and that's because of the use of diagonals. And now we're going to take a look at some varieties of line. Now, these first two varieties go kind of hand in hand, and these are also terminologies that artists are going to use the most often in describing line. So our first one is rectilinear line, and this refers to a straight line, something that is most likely man-made, and rarely, if ever, are we going to find these types of lines in nature. When we look at Mondrian's composition with red, blue, and yellow, it is made up entirely of rectilinear line. And again, we have straight lines, they're man-made, we're not going to find these in nature. This painting is definitely not a landscape scene. And Mondrian was a really interesting character. He lived all the way until the mid-1940s, and he had some interesting takes on life. He did not like to use curved lines in his work because he said that they were too sensual. And this guy also did not like nature. He would go to restaurants and would ask to be sat as far away from the window as possible because he didn't want to see the outside world. But Mondrian today is someone that we completely embrace in popular culture. And these rectilinear images or these rectilinear artworks seem to be everywhere. We have cups from Barnes & Noble, or couture. And even the Partridge Family bus is one gigantic mobile Mondrian painting. Now our next term is curvilinear line, and as you can imagine, it is curved lines. So rectilinear and curvilinear are something that artists use all the time to describe their work. These lines are natural, flowing, and organic, and it is a form that we're going to commonly see in nature. And with this work, We'd Filled with Crows by Van Gogh, we've got a work that lives on curvilinear line. Even the pathways that are constructed through the wheat field here, which should be man-made and should be straight, are not. They curve off in different directions. And even though throughout the lectures I use a lot of times paintings for explanations and for examples, but we can also apply these terms to sculpture and other medium. So on the left here we have a sculpture of Zeus, absolutely in more of a rectilinear format, whereas the sculpture of Aphrodite at the right, definitely both her body and stance are more curvilinear. Now, because this is the subject of art, art is never black and white. A lot of times on the exam, I'm going to give you very easy, very straightforward images to look at in terms and such. But in real life, we're going to come across works like this, where we could argue both ways, rectilinear or curvilinear. And in this case, both would be correct. And as we learn more about art, we're going to learn that it's really important to build our case for using this terminology. So having a basis of terminology, the vocabulary and such is important, but then it's applying those terms to a work of art. In this case, this photograph is really what we're looking at as our end result. Our next two lines are also similar, outlines and contour lines. And we'll begin with outlines. Outlines indicate the edges of a figure or object. They have a stencil-like quality to them. They deal with two dimensions. So this is going to be flat, two-dimensional art. And outlines also tend to be bold and obvious to the viewer. So when we look at this early cave painting, this is absolutely outline, bold and obvious to the viewer, stencil-like quality, 2 dimensions, indicates the edges of a figure or an object. This perfectly suits the definition. And outlines are important. We see this a lot in early primitive art. We see it as coloring book art. This is the way that we first learn how to draw as children. But that's not to say that outlines are exclusively for children or early man. This is a work by Keith Haring, one of the most famous contemporary artists, specifically of the 1990s, and he utilizes outline heavily in all of his drawings and paintings. Contour lines are similar because they also indicate the edges of a figure or an object. However, here we're concerned with establishing volume. So contour line, think of it as creating curves. We deal with 3-dimensional art on this level. And with this example here, you can see that this is more of a real person's foot and lower leg. This is something that we want to create mass and 3-dimensionality with. The same thing with this dog. Curved lines indicating the edges of a figure or an object, establishing mass and 3-dimensionality, completely different than a version of Snoopy at the right where you've got 2-dimensional forms. So on the left, we have contour line. On the right, we have outline. Now, our next line is called implied line, sometimes referred to as psychic line. These lines are so cool because they're invisible. These are lines that we understand as being there, even though no physical line truly exists. But in art, that makes this extremely powerful. We have examples such as line of sight, where everyone's looking at one particular object. It's going to force you to look at that object as well. An eye contact or gaze between 2 individuals. And even pointing. These are all examples of implied line. With the Assumption and Consecration of the Virgin, implied line is used throughout the work. It's used to break it up into different registers, but it's also used to make the work very readable. So here we have some horizontal lines that stretch across the image, breaking up God from Mary and also Mary from the apostles below her. When we look at the implied line of God looking down toward Mary, the cherubs pointing, and the apostles all looking up towards Mary, we automatically know that she is going to be the focal point of this work. And even if we didn't know anything about the Christian religion, we can still identify who is the most important person to be looking at. This work is one of the few altarpieces from the Renaissance that are in its original location. In Latin, the term is in situ. And so if you go up to Venice today at the Santa Maria dei Ferrari, which is this beautiful Gothic church, you're going to be able to see this artwork in its intended location. Most of these altarpieces have been taken down, bought and sold. Many of them exist in museums today, very few in their intended location. And just to give you an idea of size, this altarpiece is 22 feet in height. And just the opening of this area here where we're looking at, the altar area of this church, is roughly about a 6-story building. In this painting, we're first going to look at the little girl because of the value contrast her dress brings to us. And we'll talk about value contrast in the lecture on color. But we see that she's looking toward the older woman playing the piano, and we follow her gaze along to her. And then the older woman is looking down toward her hands and the keyboard, and from there we pick up the whiteness of the girl's dress again. So the use of implied line here lets us move around this painting in a counterclockwise flow. Now our next type of line is one of my favorites. It is expressive line. And this conveys the mood and feeling of the artist. I wrote down that there is an autographic quality to this type of line because it's very personal. Each of us is going to create a different type of expressive line, and one of the artists who's most famous for this type of line is Vincent van Gogh. And we're going to have a lecture completely on him later on in this semester. But we can almost see the pathway his hand takes in the creation of this work. There's something very personal, very emotional, very human to this artwork, and I think that's why we like it so much. Earlier in this lecture, we looked at Wheat Field with Crows. And what I'd like you to do is to stop the recording for just a moment and write down some adjectives, some words that describe what this painting relates to you, what it means to you, what you think Van Gogh was trying to communicate to us through this work. Once you're done with that, go ahead and restart the recording. And so normally a lot of the terms that we come up with for this work are going to be loneliness, isolation, darkness, sadness. Very few people are going to say this painting really makes me happy. To me, it's really the perfect type of Halloween painting. It's a Halloween evening painting to me. But then we learn that in this painting, this is the last one that he completes. After he finishes this work, he's going to go out to a wheat field, very much like this, put a revolver to his chest, and commit suicide. So those feelings of loneliness and isolation definitely pervade this work. And we'll talk more about Van Gogh's death and his apparent suicide in that later lecture. Another person who does a very expressive line is Jackson Pollock. And this is one of his famous drip paintings. He would create these on the ground and he would pour and splash paint. The way he would wave his hands we would call the heroic gesture. And he would also listen to jazz music while he was creating these. And so a lot of people say that this is the manifestation of jazz. A contemporary artist who utilizes expressive line is Karen Davy. And in her work, this to me relates back to our very first slide about the definition of line. It's a point set in motion. Moving on from expressive line to analytical line, this is really as far away as you can get from expressive line. This line is precise, it's controlled, based on mathematical principles, and it's easily recreated. So you and I can do this. This wall drawing by Sol LeWitt, which isn't even by Sol LeWitt. The people who created this artwork were the workers at the museum. Sol LeWitt, all he did was write up a set of directions. And in the Roles of the Artist lecture, I showed you this image of Herb and Dorothy. These are the people who were friends with Sol LeWitt and purchased that work. Toward the end of their lives, they donated all their artwork to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and this is where you're going to be able to see the wall drawing. Now, there they only did 4 images, but Sol LeWitt left directions for all sorts of different types of wall drawings. And I'm just going to show you a couple of them here. Composition with red, blue, and yellow. We talked about this as rectilinear line. This is also analytical line. It's precise, controlled, based on mathematical principles, and easily recreated. So I usually say that if you and I can recreate an artwork, it's going to be analytical line. Our last type of line is classical line. And classical line refers back to the Greek and Roman era, which is the classical age. Their artwork can be defined as simple, well-proportioned, balanced, symmetrical, and it can involve ratios in its creation. All of these really are mathematical terms, and a lot of people try to group analytical and classical line together, and they do have that small bonding moment. However, classical line is based on beauty and aesthetics. So we're not going to be able to necessarily be able to reproduce classical line. When we look at a painting like the Oath of the Horatii, we've got a work that is created in linear perspective, and that's a term and a process we'll learn about in a later lecture. But here it's very mathematical in terms of the way the building is set up. There's a certain symmetry to the arches and columns in the background, and there's also ratios with how these figures are created. However, when we look at this work, we can say that it is absolutely beautiful. This one, we'd have a difficult time arguing the idea of aesthetics and beauty here. But here we can say it's beautiful, and there's mathematical elements because of the perspective and because of the ratios involved in creating this work. We do have two more terms, and these are important because we're going to utilize these in a later lecture. Hatching and cross-hatching deal with closely spaced parallel lines. And that's what hatching is. Hatching is all the lines going in one direction compared to cross-hatching where the lines are going to overlap. And we can see from the image at the right that we kind of have a very light value artwork at the top, and as we move down to the bottom artwork, it starts to get a lot darker and heavier. And the manipulation of value is how light or how dark an object is going to be. And we're going to see this used in comics, but more importantly for our class in fine art, we're going to see it in engravings and etchings, dry points. And this is the way an artist can create how light or dark an object is. But since it's based on line, it should be in this lecture. Now we're going to do one final exercise. So you're going to need a sheet of paper. And I'm going to introduce you to these two individuals. Now the person at the right probably doesn't need any introduction. It's Pablo Picasso, one of our most famed artists. And he was friends with the gentleman at the left, Igor Stravinsky. And while Picasso was a modernist artist, Stravinsky was a modernist composer. And they both worked in the 1920s on certain ballets. Picasso creating the sets and costume, Stravinsky creating the music. And they went to a party together on December 31st, 1920, where Picasso draws this image of Stravinsky. And that's what I'm going to have you do for the next 7 minutes. So you're going to go ahead and stop this recording and then time yourself for 7 minutes. It's best to do this on a plain piece of white printer paper. Once you're done with this drawing, you can restart the recording. So how did you do? It's like kind of crazy to think about that this work is made completely out of line, and that's why we are doing this exercise. So with this work, what I'm going to have you do now is I'm going to have you turn that original drawing over, and I'm going to have you redraw this work, but we're going to redraw it in a little bit different way. We're going to draw it upside down. And what I want you to do is kind of move away from the idea that you're reproducing an image, that instead you're just focusing on the line itself that was used to create this drawing, and just recreate that. Again, I'd like you to spend 7 minutes on this work. And when you're done, you can restart the presentation. All right, so we're done with our drawing. Which one did you do better on? We have, this is kind of a basic left brain, right brain activity. And if you did better on this drawing here, our first drawing, it means you're more associated with the left brain. This image deals with how we normally process the world. It's our analytical side of the brain. We're going to try to reproduce the world with the intention of how things really should look. If you ended up doing better on this drawing, this is where we no longer see the drawing of a person. Instead, we see an ordered set of line and spaces. It is no longer a recognizable image. Our creative or abstract side of our brain takes over. I hope you found this to be a fun drawing project, and this is going to conclude our lecture about line.